You guys keep downplaying the strawberries, but I'm really committed to the fantasy that this is like
there are almost no strawberries at the festival. I know. That's the thing. It's like it's a flea market that's called the Strawberry Festival. And I think they also have like strawberry shortcake.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just can't get it in my head. Maybe because the strawberries that Patrick just provided from the farm were so good.
Right.
The Mennonite farmer, they're great. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like it's a little bit like what you're picturing is like a California strawberry festival.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Where there's like, all those flats of strawberries and it's like, but we do pick our own strawberries here though.
Cute.
Yeah.
There could be an occult dimension to the Strawberry Festival that we as non-locals don't fully appreciate, right? It could be code. It could be like an after hours thing. It could probably involve sex and that former church, I'm just saying. I'm willing to be open to anything.
I'd like to exchange a strawberry.
Show a single strawberry.
I will at some point get this 90210. I would like to exchange an egg thing on the beginning of the podcast.
Oh man, I'd love to get a Roman clerical collar and like a black shirt and just one strawberry and bite into the strawberry and then have the juice just drip down my cheek and I'm here for the festival. Yeah. So what we're doing, in other words, here is we're doing an exegesis of the Strawberry Festival, working to untease the distinction between its nominal work purpose and the basic assumption that secretly drives it.
Which is?
Fight the strawberry.
Or flee the strawberry.
Fight the strawberry, flee the strawberry, pair with the strawberry, become dependent on the strawberry.
Christine, what are you reading? Are you reading anything good?
I just read this really interesting book by this guy, Wilfred Bion. Have you guys heard of him?
Welcome. You are listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kleachin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And we are joined today by...
I'm Christine Smallwood.
Christine, we're so psyched to have you here. Are you okay if I do your intro?
Yeah, I'm also very psyched to be here.
So Christine Smallwood is a novelist and literary critic who also reviews movies and occasionally profiles celebrities and cultural figures. Her criticism has appeared in places like Harper's, Book Forum, and the New York Review of Books. And she is also a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine. Christine's debut novel, The Life of the Mind, came out in 2021. A little more on that in a little bit. On a more personal note, Christine is a dear friend, and also someone. How do I want to put this? I feel like Christine, we've shared this parallel intellectual trajectory in a way that, like, I don't know, we haven't gotten to do with anybody else, right?
Should we say that we were college roommates?
We were college roommates, but then we also went to grad school together.
Yes.
And when we were in grad school, we also co-founded a school together, the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, along with Ajay Singh Chaudhry and Michael Brent. And Christine is just one of those people that I'm really privileged to think with. And it's especially amazing that we're getting to do this in person in our little recording studio, which, the rest of the week is my home office. And so we asked her to be on the podcast and we were like, Christine, what do you want to talk about? Pick anything. And she was like, let's talk about Wilfred Bion's experiences in groups, because that is a book that I think have not shut up about since whenever I read it. I definitely have gotten Dan obsessed with it. Also, more on that in a little bit. And Patrick read it for the first time this week, as far as I know.
Yeah, I've read lots of it put together, but I actually sat down and read the whole thing.
This was your I'm going to have the experience of reading experiences in groups all in one. So, okay, before we get to who this guy Wilfred Bion is and what this book is all about, I want us to be able to ask Christine a couple of questions about her own relationship to psychoanalysis, literary criticism, etc. So are you all ready to get into it?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, cool. Christine, can you tell us, as a person, as a novelist, as a critic, however you want to answer this question, what's your relationship to psychoanalysis? Like, what role does it play in your life, work, writing, thinking, relationships, politics? You don't have to answer all of those things. Just like pick wherever you want to dive in.
Okay, so I would say that the first time I read Freud was in college, probably in a class I took with you, Abby, or maybe in a class I took at the same time that you were taking a different class where you were also reading Freud.
There's a lot of that.
I definitely remember getting pleasure out of the intellectual challenge, but I didn't at that time feel like, oh, I had found my guy.
Yeah.
But then when I was in graduate school, early in graduate school, my second year, I was involved in a reading group that was definitely completely driven by Bion's basic assumptions, which we can talk about later or not. But in that group, someone wanted to read The Interpretation of Dreams. And so I read it in that group and was really taken with it. It was definitely a kind of gateway drug. I remember talking about it with you at the time.
Yeah.
I know that's
my touchstone.
Book.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense as a touchstone because it lays out so much of the kind of, I don't know, like how we interpret anything. So it kind of makes sense too for someone like me who was getting a PhD in English, that book would have been a spark. And then after that, I just started reading more psychoanalysis, often with other people. You know, I was thinking this week about groups, and I do really like to read psychoanalytic theory with others. So I read a lot of Freud with a friend in graduate school, and then some Lacan and Klein and Winnicott. And my dissertation was definitely influenced by psychoanalytic theory, especially Klein and her idea of the depressive position. But then since then, I think it's more like that Kenneth Burke idea of equipment for living. I mean, I definitely look at everyday situations through a psychoanalytic lens. And as a parent, there are many things that I just wouldn't be able to cope with or understand without some knowledge of psychoanalysis. You and I have talked about breastfeeding, which I think just doesn't make sense without Klein, and watching my kids, try to destroy objects and people around them would not make sense without Winnicott. So I definitely use it more as like a framework for everyday life. And I don't really think of myself as a psychoanalytic critic, but because it informs how I see things, I think it probably is informing how I write.
So I know we haven't gotten to group psychology yet, but I wanted to ask if you could say a few words about your novel, The Life of the Mind, which I loved, and which is deeply painful, I think, for anyone committed to a belief in intellectual community, anyone committed to any intellectual tradition, and which is, I think, also very relevant to thinking about people in groups and what they think they're doing versus what their actual purpose is. So can you just tell us a little bit about the novel?
Yes. Okay, so my novel, The Life of the Mind, is about an adjunct professor of English whose name is Dorothy, who has had a miscarriage just before the novel begins and doesn't want to talk about it to anyone, not even her therapist, and kind of has withheld the information from her therapist, and so is now seeing a second therapist to kind of work through why she's not talking to the first therapist. And over the course of the book, Dorothy is kind of coping with the end of a lot of fantasies about the future, both related to the pregnancy, which was not planned. But one of the things that Dorothy is struggling with is kind of having even the option of making a plan taken away from her. And then also dealing with the kind of end of her fantasies about a career and, what it means to live in, quote, adjunct hell. And yeah, I was thinking about groups with Dorothy, and it's funny because Bion has that line about how even a recluse is a member of a group and can't be understood without some reference to the group. Because I think I would have said before preparing for this podcast that, Dorothy was really in her own head and kind of alienated, but now I'm starting to see that maybe she doesn't make sense except as like an appendage or even like a ghostly appendage of some groups. But of course, there's lots of groups in the book. She goes to a conference, she goes to a party. But my favorite group moment in the book is when she's in a shared Uber ride.
Yeah.
And she's the first person who gets into the Uber. And then the other person who joins the ride doesn't realize that she's there until he gets out of the car. So it's kind of a moment where a group has existed, but not everyone has been aware of its terms. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing.
I mean, I did get to read early versions of the novel. And I still remember like the moment that I like read the bit about how she gets a second therapist to talk about her relationship with her first therapist. Is there a world in which you might read that section for us?
Yeah. So I'm going to read from my book, which I haven't done in a while. This is fun. Okay. So yeah, I'll just start. For 3 years running, this is talking about the first therapist. For 3 years running, they had been meeting every Tuesday, save a New Year's holiday and the 31 days of August, in the stuffy 15th floor studio on Central Park West, with its treetop view and standard issue decor, African masks, Oriental rugs, Afghan throws, South American flutes. Dorothy was comforted by the therapist's warmth and womanliness, her aging but elastic skin, the way she clucked and wiped her hands like someone who had seen it all and intended to save you the trouble of seeing it for yourself. Still, more and more it worried Dorothy to have entrusted her mental health to one who made such little effort against the tide of cliché. It was one thing for problems, even solutions, to be unoriginal, another for presentation. When the worrying got too intense, Dorothy had a choice of palliatives arrayed in pouncing distance of the saggy patient sofa. Stress balls, beads, figurines for rubbing and handling, various sized pillows for pounding and embracing, and the eternal tissue box draped in its hand-knitted elephant gray cover. The box was always full. The therapist must be keeping watch on the box's levels. Dorothy respected her attention to detail. Fullness, plenitude, preparedness, a material well of empathy, excellent clinical values all. But where did the therapist hide the half-full boxes? Or did she cram new tissues into the same old box between sessions? How old was the box? And how old were the tissues at the deepest, most archaeological substratum? And what might happen if Dorothy had a particularly lacrimal session and made it all the way down to the bottom? She took the elevator down to the stacks. She's in the library. She was not sorry she had skipped the session, but she missed seeing her therapist. She wondered what she was doing with her free hour. Not long ago, Dorothy had started seeing a second therapist, in whom she confided her doubts about the first therapist. This was only a temporary situation. Dorothy wasn't a millionaire.
So good.
It's so good. I also love the like tiny coded like nod to civilization and its discontents with the palliative measures bit.
That was unintentional, but I'm sure there. Yeah.
I thought it was not intentional, but it's totally there. You know what I'm talking about? The like life is too hard for us.
Yeah,
like
life is too hard. Yeah.
Life is too hard. And like the theme of today is like group life is too hard. How was that for a segue?
Great segue.
Thank you. So, okay, we're going to get into this book that we've been telling you we're going to get into. We're going to. And Patrick, I'm going to ask you to do two things for us in whatever order you want to. One is to tell us a little bit about group psychology in Freud, because I think you need to have a little bit, like you, the listener, need to have a little bit of a sense of what's going on with Freud's kind of like small, I would call it, like foray into group psychology, in order to see what Bion's doing that is so radically different. And two, just to tell us a little bit about who Bion is and his relationship to a figure that Christine has already brought up, Melanie Klein and the Kleinians.
Yeah. So I'll take this from a bunch of different angles. Let's start by talking about like what psychoanalytic group or theories about group behavior that Freud is working with and emerges against. And then we'll sketch that out so that we can arrive at a better understanding, both about what makes Freud's unique, but then what makes Bion really, really unique, right? We've earlier distinguished certain different areas of focus that characterize different things in the Freudian project, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's work that's more clinically oriented. There's work that's more psychological theory oriented, stuff that's in the realm of what you might call metapsychology. And then there's stuff that we have called the applied, right? This is the putting civilization on the couch,
Mm-hmm.
putting literary texts or historical events, et cetera, and using concepts or data points from the clinical or from the metapsychological to elucidate things in the contemporary world, in art and history, et cetera. And of course, there's traffic between all three of these domains, right? To the extent to which Freud has a engagement with group phenomena, first off, it's important to say that he doesn't do group therapy. He's not seeing multiple patients at the same time. There are a bunch of situations where he winds up, and this is kind of path breaking, like you learn rules by breaking them and why rules exist. But there's some situations where
major theme of
yes,
the development of psychoanalysis.
Yeah, and this is why like language of discovery is kind of helpful. Like Freud discovers that after a while, no, you probably shouldn't ask the patient's father what really happened on such and such a night, right? Or like you can't ask like little Hans's uncle, was the horse really that scary, right? Like there are others, or even like you can't do something really wild, like read a schizophrenic judge's memoir, like like you can't. Through the work of his editor, right? There are others in the room, which is to say there's always a thirdness, right? There's always these Oedipal type things, et cetera. But there's generally speaking only one person on the couch, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Freud is not doing like a group session. Yeah. So there's that. When Freud is thinking about group behaviors, of course, he does talk a lot about this one particular group, which we call the family,
mm-hmm.
right? And the way in which that changes and the way in which the individual is constituted in that. But when Freud does stuff that we might associate more with, like, let's call organizational psychology or group psychology or social psychology or any of other sort of different domains for that, for these types of questions, where these questions play out, what he's engaging in is generally some combination of armchair anthropology, history, and general sort of speculation or psychoanalytically informed criticism of contemporary events. So he'll do some stuff about like, he'll make broad claims or will do really interesting work into, say, the group dynamics that characterize, say, Judaism during the patriarchal period, right? Or the changes that happen to the family or to the idea of sexual reproduction and family life under early Christianity,
sure.
Or the stressors that are put under the modern family in sort of the industrial era in which he's working, right? But these are all sort of, well, ethnographic, right? They isolate a given set of people in a given set of time, and they kind of account for their behavior. Now, there's a reason why that's his sort of orientation, and that orientation goes beyond just the fact that he is not doing group therapy. So there's a reason why Freud is doing it in this kind of anthropological, ethnographic mode, this kind of armchair mode, which, by the way, is what he's doing in the latter half of his writing.
Yeah.
So
this is like the late 20s and the 30s.
Yeah, exactly. And in order for us to sort of grasp what's singular about this, it's important to note that what oftentimes gets translated in English as group psychology, right? Freud's book, Group Psychology, the word in German is closer to what we call mass.
Yeah.
Right? And mass psychology. And in this way, Freud is recognizably continuing a tradition, but also profoundly critiquing, rejecting, and offering an alternative to a 19th century and early 20th century quintessentially imperial notion of group psychology, which is being generated in places like Berlin, Oxford, and Paris.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all about understanding groups, but the idea of what groups are there are specific ethnicities or peoples who are around the world,
mm-hmm.
or are otherwise dispersed in the past or around the globe, and who are understood as being societies that are more or less frozen in time.
Yeah.
Right? That are also lower quote unquote more primitive or inferior compared to the observing anthropological, psychological gaze from your university office in Berlin, in Cambridge, in Paris, or whatever, right? And for whom in the consideration of the task is, how are we going to categorize these people in order to either civilize them or to work a civilizational project of control around them? Unlike all of this, what Bion does is Bion sees what Freud's arguments about the libidinal dimensions of group cohesion as only one feature of a much broader theory.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to get ahead of what we're saying here, but just to stipulate the distinction here. Whereas Freud is putting civilization and its groups, whether they be Bolsheviks or the family,
Mm-hmm.
on the couch, and he is kind of like looking at it from this distanced perspective. Bion's move is to literally consider groups of people doing what we would call group therapy, but also doing other types of organizational work,
Mm-hmm.
and to map out descriptively what seem to be the patterns or themes that constitute how they interact with each other. In other words, too, he's not like about defining mental agencies, being like, well, this person is the superego of the group, or being like, this is the libido that it all runs on. Instead, he's much more interested in developing a stance for describing group behavior. And also, unlike either the anthropologist in the Imperial War College or Freud with his books about ancient Egypt and ancient Greece, Bion puts a lot of emphasis on his role as a participant observer in the study and maintenance of these groups.
That feels like a good segue for me to ask you to tell us a little bit about who Bion is, and maybe to situate people in terms of like where he is in the history of psychoanalysis.
Yeah, cool. So Bion, I should say, is not someone who you necessarily read in a lot of traditions. There are many people who find in lots of American psychoanalysts.
He's really undersung.
He's
tragically
undersung in the
undersung.
US. Yeah, largely because of his Kleinian ties, I think, is one of the reasons for that.
That's right.
And also because he's very difficult. Though I will say he's difficult in a way that like Freud or Lacan are difficult, because you got to figure out what this theory is. Whereas Bion describes, he's much more interested in a stance of description than he is in like hard and vindicating terms. But to as to his biography, and I'll quickly sketch this out, right? Because I think it sort of helps.
Yeah,
right?
that would be good.
Bion, and I think you'll see why also some of these historical notes are helpful. And please, and chime in if I say something that isn't clear, right? But like Bion, Wilfred Ruprecht Bion, the classic name, right? Is born in the British Raj, right?
Yes.
He's born in India.
Mm-hmm.
So he's already, this is again, this whole colonial, there's some interesting stuff happening here, right? But he's born in 1897 in what is at the time occupied India, right? And this becomes important for a variety of reasons, including a facility with language, a certain orientation towards religion that he develops, and even later on, he recovers these memories of like the sound Om that he associates with a certain basic connection. He has a lovely autobiography. If people want to check out, right?
Yeah.
He spends the first 8 years or so of his life in India working, living with his father. I think his father is a civil engineer or something like that and does stuff for the British government. But then eventually he goes to receive his education in the UK, in England proper. And it's right around this period where he's born in 1897 when the First World War happens. Now, I'm going to say a few things about his role in the First World War because this is really important, and it's going to also be a thing where people are going to be like, I think we would be afraid. Some listeners here are like, oh no, Patrick's talking too much. This is a weird tangent. I promise this will come back later as a helpful series of metaphors.
Yeah.
I promise.
Oh, and I'm just going to say up front, military psychiatrist.
Yeah.
That part's important.
Yeah. Where we're arriving at from this is basically Bion is going to serve in World War I, and then he's going to leave World War I, discover Freud, by reading Freud, and then because of Freud, become a psychiatrist,
Mm-hmm.
and will be analyzed, among others, by John Rickman, and then after the Second World War by Melanie Klein.
Yeah.
But during these periods, he works for the military and works with vets. But I want to talk a little bit about the First World War experience right on its own terms. I think this is an important one, right, too. And in some ways, it's very helpful, too, to think about this alongside Freud, because, like, these are both thinkers that are forced to develop their understandings, not just of individual interior life, but of world historical changes that sweep up other people's and their behaviors and dreams and anxieties in tremendously dramatic, brutal ways, right? The young Bion becomes a tank commander. He gets involved in the tank service. You probably didn't see this one coming, but you need to know a little bit about tanks, I think, for this to work properly. I promise. Okay, yes. Someone else just like this.
You want a verbal nod, don't you?
I want a verbal.
It's okay, Patrick, if you want to talk about tanks.
I really want to talk. It's okay, Christine. You don't feel like.
No, I'm interested.
Oh, are you sure? Because some people are like, oh, it's too much Patrick talking about. Patrick has too much ADD and is talking about tanks. But look, here's the deal. Here's the deal with tanks, right? Like, let's work.
What's the deal with tanks?
What's the deal?
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
All right. We're going to cut that. Just tell us about fucking tanks already.
All right. This is all very granular and sounds kind of wild, but what this basically means is if you are commanding one of these things, you hear, apart from the fact that you have to protect your 8 or 12 men who are working under you from a situation in which they could die of enemy fire, they could die of accidental explosion, they could die of an explosion of an engine, they could burn to death, they could drown, which happens all the time. They'll fall through one and there's no way out. They'll turn over. These are death traps, right? But you have to communicate with them over the noise, in the smoke, in the heat of battle. Moreover, you have to communicate with the other tanks that are moving in the broader operation, because the whole deal with tanks is that you move forward to push through lines and other infantry are behind you. So you have to somehow maintain situational awareness of the group inside the tank, of the group of tanks, and the group of infantry all around you in situations that are beyond taxing of your capacity to speak, to talk, to signal. It's a deafening, overwhelming sensory experience. So kind of not, and Bion is an excellent tank commander. He receives numerous decorations. He fights at Cambrai. He gets a French, I think, Légion d'honneur. So he's incredibly good at this, right? But the reason I went so far into this, right, is, and I think it will work for us as a metaphor, is just imagine how a person who not only does this for 4 years, but does it extremely well for 3 or 4 years, would have to approach or have to develop a capacity to approach questions of communication, of signaling, of navigation, of knowing where other people are going. Because you can't have like one tank, if a tank falls into a trench, maybe you can't let other people know that you're in a trench. Or how do you know that someone else has fallen in a trench? You have to develop a very agile, open sort of way of dealing with gaps in understanding, misinterpretation, the flows of battle, the flows of terror, literal shell shock in a situation where the stakes are about as high as you can possibly imagine. So that, I think, kind of plays in the background here, such that when he, after the war, begins to work in a variety of clinics with veterans, he's very interested in questions like how can leaders be formed?
Yeah.
How can effective leaders operate in circumstances like this? But also, how can groups operate independently in a situation where, I don't know, your poor leader has just fallen on the interior engine and now is a human barbecue, right? So his efforts to thematize group or to explore group dynamics from the participant, not just of an observer, but as a participant observer with responsibility for the well-being of the people around him, seems very grounded in this. And so his work thereafter he works in military psychology, et cetera. And we'll talk more about that and does a lot of seminars in this. But these orientation towards groups, communication, the limits thereof, it seems key.
But do you guys think that also he then had a certain expectation that groups could function effectively or efficiently? And like in a high stakes military situation, everybody in the tank is really invested in the group working.
Yeah.
But of course, in like our low stakes classrooms or reading groups or Occupy Wall Street cells or whatever, like there's a lot of energy pulling away from getting the task done. And do you think Bion was really frustrated outside of that military context?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I guess I want to take that question partly because I want to say like a couple things about the text and just like frustration, like this is like vibes analysis more than anything else, but like okay, this book comes out in 1961, I think that's right, and I could give you like the main points, but I feel like it's more helpful to give you like the main feelings that it produces in a sense, which might sound like really like flaky or woo-woo, but is also like integral to what he is doing and thematizing. So I feel like I can't overstate the extent to which, for at least like the first half of this book, at least I feel like, is this man trolling me? Do you know what I mean? And like is he for real? Like, so there's like a lot of doing nothing on the part of the analyst, which is Bion. So like the folks at the Tavistock Clinic are like, in I think it's 1948, are like, will you take groups? You can't see my air quoting. And he's like, well, I'm supposed to take groups. And he shows up and he does nothing, right? Like he certainly doesn't give an explanation as to like, he's not walking in and being like, you know, the way I do, like, hey, I'm Professor Kluchin. This is like whatever class. Like, here are my fucking learning goals, right? He's not like, you know, we're gonna do these sorts of things. Like, no, he shows up, and as far as I can tell, the only explanation he gives to the people in his group, the groups that he is taking, are that saying that he's interested in tensions in groups, and then occasionally making like a sort of Vadic interpretation. And here's a line that I think encapsulates this nicely from experiences in groups. He says, quote, "In the groups in which I am psychiatrist, I am the most obvious person, by virtue of my position, in whom to vest a right to establish rules of procedure. I take advantage of this position to establish no rules of procedure and to put forward no agenda." Close quote. And you're like, okay, that's page 77, right? And that's like the first time that he's like, no, really, like that. This is what I'm doing. Like, and you still don't really know, is he fucking with you? Is he fucking with the people in the groups? So he's letting things unfold in a way which I feel like I certainly would experience as like deeply withholding, were I a person that showed up to be like, I would like to get better in some way. But so, you know, he makes these interpretations. He does these things like telling the group, like, well, you seem awfully set on having a leader, you know, like, and like, let me be clear, like, this is hilarious. Okay. Also, in addition to like, so this, I said I was going to answer Christine's question, because what I want to say is like one of the primary affects of this text is that it is frustrating, and that's, again, it's on purpose. He thematizes this frustration while he's talking about the group dynamics that he observes, sometimes in abstract terms and sometimes in like little dialogues. And the implication, like the idea is always like, okay, people show up, they think they're going to get some sort of satisfaction. Inevitably, they get the opposite of satisfaction, which is frustration. And I think the important part, and the part where you're like, oh, as you like hang in there with Bion, you realize that like he is not trolling you mostly. It's not because he is like deliberately frustrating or thwarting their expectations, although he is doing that. Like, let's be clear. It's that something about group life or group experience is in itself frustrating, which I feel like anyone who's ever worked in like the corporate world or like has ever been in a meeting or, you know, or even just in like a classroom, like could tell you, right? Like, so there's something very, very honest about this. So, and he says also like that, like, it's confusing. He returns again and again to the idea that like you, reader, like you're like all comfortable by yourself right now reading this, but like in the group, like the emotions are really heightened.
Yeah, I mean, and I feel like I got a lot of clarity late in the book when he basically says, oh, by the way, you actually can't do therapy with more than one person at a time. Like psychoanalysis in a group just isn't possible. So I don't do that. So when someone expresses a like neurotic symptom, I can't actually treat that because we're in a group. All I can do is treat the group dynamic that develops around the expression of that symptom. But what he doesn't do is say, hey, everybody, I'm Dr. Bion, and I'm actually not going to address what you think is going to happen in this group. I think the frustration comes from that lack of information because everyone in the group still seems to be under this idea that they're there to get therapy.
Right. And he is a psychiatrist. Right. Like, and they are there for that reason. So let me say one or two more things that I just like by way of being like a couple of key points before we like all get into it, including just like two little like nuggets that I wanted to pull out and read. Because again, it can be a uniquely frustrating book to read, but it also has these like little like pearls where you're just like, oh, that's exactly what it's like to be in a group. Okay, so here's one. Anyone who has any contact with reality is always consciously or unconsciously forming an estimate of the attitude of his group towards himself. I know, it's really good, right? And here's the other one. It can be seen that what the individual says or does in a group illumines both his own personality and his view of the group. Sometimes his contribution illumines one more than the other. But then he's also going on to point out that like, okay, so like we're in a group right now. There's four of us here and we're making contributions. Like we're making verbal contributions. But Bion is also pointing out that members of any group also wish to, and in fact do, make some contributions, what he calls anonymously. Yeah. And this is what he ends up calling a group mentality, is these sort of like anonymous contributions to the group. And probably the single most important thing to do, to take away here is that every group has what Bion is going to call a basic assumption. And I'm going to ask you all in a minute, not anonymously, like to talk about like what this means. So it has nothing to do with the explicit purpose for which a group has formed, right? That's what he calls the work group, or sometimes he calls it the sophisticated group. To be clear, like that doesn't mean like the people necessarily. It's like at the time, the thing, like the dimensions of this thing that are happening with a certain purpose. So like right now we are a work group gathered around for the purpose of like talking about Wilfred Bion and I don't know, expanding access to psychoanalytic education, something like that. But underlying this in this group and every other is what Bion calls a basic assumption. And here is what Bion says about the basic assumption. As far as the group is concerned, the basic assumption is essentially a tacit assumption. Individuals behave as if they were aware of the assumption, and it is for this reason that the interpretation of the basic assumption carries conviction. It is a statement that gives meaning to the behavior of the group as a whole. Yet the assumption is not overtly expressed even when it is being acted on. We thus have a situation in which the individuals behave as if they were conscious as individuals of the basic assumption, but unconscious of it as members of the group. This is as it should be. The group has not a conscious, and it is not articulate. It is left to the individual to be both. So there are only three basic assumptions for Bion. There's what he calls the dependent group, the fight or flight group, and the pairing group. And I thought I would just kind of see if we could collectively generate, sketch out like what he means, starting with the dependent group. How do you all understand this idea here? The group for which the basic assumption, which by the way can change. Like it's not like a group has one basic assumption. In fact, they can be going through multiple ones, or they can have the same one. So what's the dependent group all about?
One way of framing a sort of basic like part of what the dependent group involves is like you're depending upon some figure, or there's some sort of authority, or there's some sort of premise which is essential to the group and that has to be protected. Or another way of framing this would be, this is the survival of the group is a self-given thing that needs to be maintained, right? And I'm gonna put not wheels, but continue to roll on the treads of the tank example here. It's a good one, right? Right. So the official working purpose of us in the tank is we're gonna smash through the Meuse-Argonne line and kill us some Jerry's, right? That's the mission. That's our explicit formal thing.
Yeah, it's a work group.
Our basic assumption is we're going to survive this, right? We're not going to let ourselves get killed. And thinking about a situation where, I don't know, both our treads blow out, we're stuck in a muddy field, mustard gas is coming in, and so one of our tankers is like, I got to get out, I can't be in here anymore. It's the spontaneous job of someone near that person to like cold cock them or hold them back, or worst case scenario, the person who we're singularly dependent upon, namely the tank officer, the Wilfred Bion in this figure, to maybe even shoot the guy to prevent him from opening the door and letting all the gas come in, because that would kill everybody. So this is and Bion actually.
This is a very high stakes example.
Yes, exactly, and that's Bion's example of the army is one in which the survival basic dependency thing has a lot of direct rapprochement with the stated purpose of like a mission or a work group.
Yeah.
So this is one example I'm thinking of. Yeah.
But I was thinking like, so sometimes the basic assumptions get much more active when the work group breaks down for some reason, right? Like an effective work group leader is one who can kind of channel the basic assumptions. So if you're in a classroom and the teacher is not doing their job in some way, or does not have the respect of the room, in a dependent group, right, a different leader will emerge. Like the sort of chattiest student will take over as the leader, or maybe the student who's the most hostile to the teacher will become the secret leader of the group in some way. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was thinking about, the first example that Bion gives of the dependent group is this one where he is thwarting their expectations, and they're like, lead us, damn it. Like they're looking to be dependent.
They want a leader.
They want a leader.
Yeah, they don't want to have a kind of non-hierarchical arrangement. That feels very threatening to people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the army, if we're going to talk about the second basic assumption, fight or flight,
I think that makes perfect sense.
The army is organized by the fight or flight assumption, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And that's partly why I was also like, this, I don't think he's really saying that multiple basic assumptions can be operating at the same time, but a group can flow through them really, really, really rapidly. And so like in Patrick's example, like you're actually in a fight or flight situation, but then the need for the leader becomes like really, really important very quickly. And then, so I think those two are like a little bit easier to understand.
And I think this is why I ultimately why I wanted to talk about the tank thing, and because this is where the rubber hits the road, right? Like, or the treads hit the road. Yeah, the trenches. The trenches
no
hit
rubber
there are no
on a
roads.
tank.
Yeah, there are no roads
and
either
no
anymore.
roads.
Yeah. But there's something, I think, without psychoanalyzing Bion in a way we can't, right? There's something kind of awesome about the fact that after having spent time in situations in which the stakes are so clear for deviance, right? Or for like failure to accomplish the mission or whatever, right? He can then enter a room and just be like, yeah, I'm in charge here, supposedly, and just sit there, and everyone else can start freaking out.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, he's like, well, look, there's no mustard gas here, right? If we walk outside this room, no one's going to get like, torn apart by bullets or like war dogs. But isn't it weird that we all feel anxiety that something has to happen in here?
Yeah.
Isn't it weird that everyone here is looking at me as though I am piloting this tank?
Yeah. It's a little disingenuous because he is piloting the tank. But yes.
He's sending them back to the front too, but that's another matter.
Right.
So the group either has to take, and this bears on the question also of like the switching between groups, right? Each one of these groups, each one of these basic assumptions can find expression in different group patterns, but also in different, looking to different types of leaders, or like evoking certain roles, or conjuring into being certain roles, right? So the fight or flight one, right, is just like we either have to find the enemy and go for the enemy and like take them down, right? Or we have to get the hell out of here.
Right.
Right. So again, I don't know. If the captain of the tank suddenly like gets shell shocked, we have to mutiny. I'm the guy in charge. We're turning around.
Okay,
right?
give us a non-military example.
Oh, I have one.
Please.
Yeah. Can I go? So, so it's like when you're in a class, which keeps coming up for me, and everybody just gets really excited about trashing the reading.
Yes.
Or when you're
like second year of grad school.
Yeah. Or when you're at a party and it's kind of like aimless, and then you realize that you all just like the same person, and you can
when it feels amazing,
trash that person, and that there's an energy all of a sudden that like you've really like found a groove for the group to just like roll in for a moment,
and anxiety dissipates. Also, I think that's important for Bion, is like once either like one of these basic assumptions like has really taken hold and is finding expression in some sort of concrete way, or else like the work group is like really happening. So like, I mean, it's like a very tidy explanation for like why, I don't mean tidy and that sounds glib. I don't mean it in that way. Either like you're really getting shit done or the psychodynamics of a situation are out of control.
Yeah. Well, and when you start thinking about parties and like, why are parties so anxiety provoking? Well, because it's not really clear what the task is.
Right.
You know, like,
what is the task?
Yeah. Who's in charge? What's the task? You know, whereas like in other situations, you can kind of find your way back to the work group or the sophisticated group. At a party, it's just kind of all floating from one basic assumption into another.
Have fun. Like that's your task is to have fun. And if you aren't doing that, also the anxiety comes back. Right. And then you go into one of these other sorts of things.
Yeah. And I know we're going to get to this later, but the exact nature of what that anxiety is about, like how parts relate to wholes is so fascinating.
Yes.
And I will get there after we talk about pairing.
Yes. And I want to say like one or two other things too.
I think of the party anxiety though, where it's like, what's the task? And it's like, I have no idea what the task is, so I'm just going to get fucked up.
Yeah.
Like
that becomes people's work.
That becomes it becomes the telos of the, it's like, what are you going to do tonight? I'm going to waste it. Because then you have a goal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm going to stand in the corner and be like, they don't know about Bion.
Patrick's amazing at parties, by the way. Okay, a party is a good way to roll into the pairing assumption. Anyone?
Yeah, so the pairing assumption is that any group of people exists so that people can pair off and mate. Bion says it doesn't have to be sexual in nature, but that there's a kind of sexual edge to it. I mean, you can see this in a classroom again when two people are really vibing off of each other. And he talks a lot about how the pairing assumption is like underwritten by a kind of messianic hope in the future.
Yeah.
So whether it's a literal biological offspring or just these people coming together, and I don't know, I'm trailing off.
I mean, he brings up the aristocracy a lot in this connection.
That part is really strange.
It's really strange, but it makes more sense in the concept of like, of British Empire. And when you're thinking about like, think less about like you yourself, not you yourself, Christine, but like you yourself, like trying to find a mate, and rather more like, how are we going to marry our daughter off?
Right.
And he also says that the psychoanalytic encounter, like the psychoanalytic dyad, that is also the basic assumption there is pairing. And it's not just because of the sort of like erotics of transference, although that's part of it. But it is like the point of it is pairing.
It seems like, and I think we could go back to some of the stuff we talked about, I think in our first or second episode, about the subject supposed to know as having some dynamics of this or is hitting some similar territory, right? The pairing assumption, so the subject's supposed to know. The analyst, there's the person who not only has knowledge, but embodies the knowledge and embodies the possibility and all your fears and hopes about knowledge. So the pairing logic here might be, well, me and this analyst, I don't think we're really going to run away together, but we're going to figure out my problems and I will have a new life.
Yeah.
Right. I think the aristocracy example in some ways almost cuts more viciously on American royal watchers than on British ones, right? Where it's like, like why the fuck were people spending so much time watching all these different like parsing the regalia and all these photos of like Prince Charles with Jimmy Savile or whoever. Look, whatever those freakish people have got going on, like there's like this weird thing where it's like, well, at least Harry and Meghan can have a fairy tale life together, and they represent the future of the monarchy. and they give us this stuff that we can sort of cathect onto. And it's weird. It's very weird, precisely on the formal level, because whether or not Harry and Meghan live or die or get their royal prerogatives or not,
they left. You know that, right?
I do know that.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure.
But I mean, like literally, whether or not they exist or don't exist, whether or not they are able to pay the British police for their protection, whatever, it doesn't fucking matter. That literally has no effect on me whatsoever, right? But what they do is they give me something where I can feel some kind of hope, right? And because I have so little hope around me otherwise, right?
Yeah. I mean, what I'm thinking about now is how he talks about. I said this to you over email, Abby. He talks about time and how the basic assumptions are kind of not in a normal relationship to time, right? Like the work group is all about staying on task and kind of watching the clock, and the meeting has to end at this time,
right?
And we have to whatever. Whereas the basic assumptions seem to exist outside of time, but maybe all of the basic assumptions, because they're also wrapped up in futurity. So maybe that, I don't really know how to put this together.
Yeah.
Do you guys know how?
It seems like time is like our like desire or an anxiety and our like mental visions of groups together form, and here's the Bionian word, like the matrix through which like time is processed. Is that maybe one way of thinking about it? Like,
I was going to say, I want to say one or two other things. I know I'm like being pedantic here. I want to say one or two other things about this book before we like get into like a whole suite of questions about it. And I feel like I'm bringing that up right now, not just because I want to be like, I want to go in order, look at my outline, but because no. But because I think part of the answer to what you're asking, Christine, has to do with how Bion is a Kleinian.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And how the basic assumptions have very much to do with a sort of like her sense of like psychosis.
Yeah.
So I think that's what's going on here. Okay, so my two quick things. One is a thing that I want to flag about what Bion says about Freud.
Yes.
And Bion says that Freud's key insight is that you can't actually tackle neurosis in the individual. Even though, like Christine said, he's like, psychoanalysis is only this thing that happens between two people. You can't do it in groups. But he says that like the field in which solutions to the problem of neurosis begin to appear, that's that field, he calls it the intelligible field of study. It is between two people. And so like what Freud does in some ways is like by insisting on the dyad in which transference happens, that's the beginning of a group. Like the smallest group is two people. And relatedly, for Bion, we are never outside a group. Like, so Christine brought up the example of the recluse, right? Like, but the recluse is in some ways defined by their relation of negation of the refusal to belong to a group.
Oh yeah.
Or the loner or whatever. The like, like I'm sitting by myself on purpose. I reject all of this. Like those things are, just as much about being, you're still in a group. Like it's just the question of like, are group dynamics visible? Like they're always at work, but they're only visible when the group is actually physically constituted. But in some other more fundamental way for Bion, it doesn't really matter whether the group is there. So that's what I wanted to say. And the other thing I wanted to flag is that, and this is why I was like, okay, I'm doing vibes analysis of experiences in groups. And also it makes sense that I'm doing that is because in a very real way, and to some listeners, this might seem like absolute common sense, and to some listeners, it might seem like wildly controversial. Bion is insistent on taking, I guess I would call it taking his own feelings as data. And this is new in Bion, and I'll ask Patrick to say more about this in a minute. It's a new extension of Melanie Klein's concept of projective identification. And I want to read one more passage about this, where you can really hear Bion saying, like, I'm doing this. And, he says before where I'm going to get into, he's like, okay, like you might think this is just about my own psychopathology, or no, my own pathology. But he says in group treatment, many interpretations, and amongst them the most important, have to be made on the strength of the analyst's own emotional reactions. It is my belief that these reactions are dependent on the fact that the analyst in the group is at the receiving end of what Melanie Klein has called projective identification, and that this mechanism plays a very important role in groups. Now, the experience of counter-transference appears to me to have quite a distinct quality that should enable the analyst to differentiate the occasion when he is the object of a projective identification from the occasion when he is not. The analyst feels he is being manipulated so as to be playing a part, no matter how difficult to recognize, in somebody else's fantasy, or he would do if it were not for what, in recollection, I can only call a temporary loss of insight, a sense of experiencing strong feelings, and at the same time, a belief that their existence is quite adequately justified by the objective situation without recourse to recondite explanation of their causation. From the analyst's point of view, the experience consists of two closely related phases. In the first, there is a feeling that whatever else one has done, one has certainly not given a correct interpretation. In the second, there is a sense of being a particular kind of person in a particular emotional situation. I believe ability to shake oneself out of the numbing feeling of reality that is a concomitant of this state is the prime requisite of the analyst in the group. If he can do this, he is in a position to give what I believe is the correct interpretation, and thereby to see its connection with the previous interpretation, the validity of which he has been caused to doubt.
Yeah.
And Patrick, I'm just going to ask you to make this clearer. Can you give this is like an impossible question for me to ask you, but can you give a quick gloss on projective identification?
Sure. And this is a term we've dealt with a little bit, I think, in the bonus episode that Dan and I recorded once, but it's a term we're going to come back to a lot. It's a term that is it both means something very technical within the work of Melanie Klein, and that has the misfortune of just on the face of it seeming to mean other things, but then later over time does actually come to mean those other things for many people.
Sure.
Right. And that's which is actually good. So we could say it's overdetermined. So first that and maybe one way to really a thing to flag here just right up front is the importance for Bion in his description of how you get attuned to this, and also for our purposes, how you get attuned to it, is a type of entering into a type of conceptual space, or like developing a capacity to think and to parse phenomena that is not immediately reactive, but that at least flags your reactions to things. And that allows you to work with reverie and consider images that come into your mind and consider things that you feel like you're going to say without immediately either enacting it or foreclosing it and saying, I would never say such a thing, or feeling bad, right? So that's sort of he uses reverie a lot from that. Okay, so projective identification, one way to understand this is to make reference to, at least initially, this idea of projection, right? Which is a classic defense mechanism, right? And we talked about this in the kettle logic episode. We can give all sorts of examples, but like projection basically is when I take something that is in me or that I'm doing, and which is quintessentially something that I'm not proud of and would rather not be doing or would rather not be seen as doing, and I put it on you. And so I say, Dan, God damn you, you're a neuroatypical guy who wants to talk way too much about tanks. Okay.
Wait, I have a question. So is an example of that if I think someone doesn't like me, but really I don't like them?
That could be one. Yeah. I mean, I think, or it could be like something, it's susceptible to certain types of transformation, right? Think about all the tropes about like, oh, these two people must really, really hate one another, and she must hate me and I must hate her. And then in the third act of whatever we actually, we secretly love one another. And we were so upset at the idea that we might love someone who we thought hates us that I think that's one way of tracking it. Yeah.
But it's a simpler mechanism
Yeah,
than projective identification.
It's a simpler mechanism. It's a very archaic mechanism, right? It's basically this thing that's in me, I don't own, I put on you.
I disavow this thing about me and attach it to you.
Yeah. And that is not quite that's not fully the sense of projective identification that's happening here, because if you were to be linearly be like, oh, I'm projecting an identification on you, right? And at least in a certain reading, I just projected my self-description as a tank maniac onto Dan. But that's not what a projective identification is. So that's the false friend incorrect definition.
We were defining projection there. Yes. Okay.
So projection is this basic defense mechanism of putting something from you or from point A onto point B. It would be incorrect to see projective identification as just or as narrowly, at least initially, putting a self-identification onto another person. That's a trap. That's not quite the way to look at it, though eventually we'll get to that through a certain byway, right? A key thing to note, though, about this projection example, and that's going to help us understand projective identification, is this idea that your self-experiences, your self-awareness, and your experiences or your willfully exerted experiences of other people are characterized by a certain permeability, right? The stuff that I don't want to see in me, I put on someone else.
Yeah.
The stuff that I don't want to see on you, I put in me, or whatever, right? For Melanie Klein, who, right, is a theorist who is interested in pre-Oedipal formations, that is, behaviors and relationships within the mother or the maternal function and the mother-infant dyad, the notion of projection and the notion of subsequent projective identification takes place in a situation in which those boundaries between self and other, between what I can own as mine and what I can see as yours, are much more unstable because you're still a kid. You're infans, right? You can't talk. You can't be like, Mom, Mom, you just shit your diaper, right? You can't do that. Instead, you just squeal. And then it's the job of your mother to figure out what's going on. That, though, is kind of how Melanie Klein does think about what projective... It's within that sort of space, right, of emergent self-other boundaries and an emergent sense of self in the child that Melanie Klein is operating, develops the notion of projective identification specifically. And there are two moves here. First, she defines projective identification as a process by which the emergent child comes to some sense of its own identity by projecting aspects of its experience, right? So, like, this is the good breast, bad breast stuff, right? I'm angry. Things are bad. Oh, the bad must be outside in Mom. No, wait, actually, Mom's bringing good things, so maybe she's a little bit good, a little bit bad. Maybe I can be capable of some bad and some good too, etc. Right? So, in other words, across these very permeable, emergent boundaries between infant and adult, the child begins to differentiate between its feelings and the feelings of those around it. And in other words, an identity emerges through the process of projection. The second half of this, though, and this is now where we can get back to thinking about actually projecting of identities in a much broader sense, right, is to think about projective identification as a way of anyone, not just a baby, but of a person, and above all, an adult person in some degree of psychic distress with unconscious pain, that they can communicate their experience to you through literally putting an emotion into you, right? Or through accessing that permeability in a way that has a contagious, or better yet, to use multiple senses of the term, communicative aspect, right? So the example here again is given, like, the child is whining, the child is whining, the child is whining. The mother picks up, oh, there's distress. The mother runs through a checklist of distress thing, and then it's like, oh, the nappy needs changing, right? Now, there are other states and places that people can be in, particularly under certain types of pressure, or if they have certain types of character patterns, where their internal emotions, anxieties, fears, desires, etc., or their traumas, whatever you may have, can be so overwhelming or so intense, but also so difficult for them to metabolize on into words, that they can also be communicated to other people. And oftentimes, for people who are not trained to look for this, it results in an enactment, right? Think about the person who you're having a fight with, like a recurrent fight where someone's like, you're going to leave me, you're going to leave me, I'm actually worthless, you're going to hate me. And you keep being like, no, I love you, I'm not going to leave you, I'm not going to leave you, I'm not going to leave you. And eventually, you get so pissed at them.
You leave them.
You either leave them.
You sure want to.
Yeah, or you yell them like, you find like you've never been violent in your life. But this person who, for no apparent reason, is cowering as though you're just going to hit them, you find like you smack your own head with your fist. You're like, what the fuck is going on?
Or you want to hit them.
Or
you feel that you want to hit them.
Yeah. Like, where is this coming from?
Yeah.
Or you say something that you would never have said, that you never say to anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, where did this come from? No, big red flag here. None of this is about like excusing anyone's behavior or like any example. This is not about like, this is not
about excusing abusive behavior. This is in a descriptive mode.
Yeah.
Wait, so how is that different than the counter-transference?
So it's a communication that's happening across the level of transference.
Mm-hmm.
Which can happen all over the place, right? Particularly in relationships that are intimate, but it's not narrowly counter-transference because it's a broader phenomena than just what a single clinician will note in their own reactions to a patient.
There's something really impersonal about it, right? If you put the same, it doesn't mean that it's not counter-transferential, because it is part of the set of feelings that the analyst is having, right? So it's just that like, but there's something impersonal about it such that like if you put just about any analyst in that situation, they would be having that feeling, and it might feel also like, where is this coming from? It's not me.
It's used. So one way to think about it and is that the material or the phenomena of projective identification is if you're attuned to it, can be a source of, it is a type of countertransference. Yes, when you're experiencing it, you're a clinician, but it can really be a source of insight.
Yes.
As opposed to it being like, fuck this, I want to walk out, which would be a countertransferential enactment in a different direction.
Right. Okay. So just hypothetically, imagine that one of my students, hypothetically, that I was feeling really activated by, just hypothetically, one of my students, and had a lot of anger towards this person. I had been calling that countertransference, but I could also maybe call it projective identification if I felt the student was enacting anger towards me that then was making me angry at them.
If it's communicating a feeling, and I think here's most feelings are contagious, right?
Yeah.
And again, there's some like technical. There's some like 6 of one, half a dozen of another thing type here, because like I think we can, for our purpose, we can all agree transference happens between all human relationships. Countertransference is just a specific thing we name for someone who's in a position of authority to manage transference, feeling it, right? But the thing about projective identification specifically is that for Klein and for a lot of analysts who work in the Kleinian tradition or who work with people who generally Freud would not see, because Freud would preoccupy himself with neurotics, not with people who we might call borderline or in some sort of bipolar or psychotic episode, right? Is that capacity to have those feelings, to note them and contain them in the analyst, becomes something that can be used as a site of intervention, right, in a particular way. Right. So countertransference, I mean, yes. So projective identification would be for people who believe in projective identification and follow Kleinian line, a subtype of countertransference, but is not actually countertransference in the sense that it's an obstacle to cure. It is in fact a source of insight. So when the patient is when the patient is behaving contemptibly, even as you're constantly telling them that they're not a bad person, and at some point, you're like, I'm so fed up with you, I wish you would just die, right? You don't say that, of course. But what if you, as an analyst, you're like, oh, this person is giving me a glimpse into how they feel about themselves in a first-person way.
Got it.
And I think part of the reason that projective identification for so many people is just like, it's unthinkable, or is the idea that there is some, like, you're making me feel that, which, like when we hear that now, we're like, oh, that actually that's like immediately red flags. That sounds abusive, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't make somebody feel something. But Melanie Klein is actually saying like, no, but what if you can?
That's so interesting with this is a tangent, but with parenting, because I follow a lot of like psychodynamically influenced parenting content in the world. And one of like the big tenets is, like your kid doesn't make you yell at them. Right. Like you make yourself yell. So no matter what they're doing, like if you're yelling, like you're wrong. I'm being really glib, but yeah, that's interesting to think about. Like, what if they actually made that happen in some way?
And like it makes sense. I mean, there's an appropriateness thing too, right? If we're talking about a pre-verbal child,
yeah,
right? Like their personality, their selfhood is not organized enough yet. Like that is a way that it makes sense to communicate in some sense. When you're getting that, when you're hypothetically receiving that hypothetically from a hypothetical student, something is going on.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because that's not a child.
Right. Right.
And for you as a teacher, you can be like, oh, you can actually, I think, develop that sort of sense of like, I'm feeling a feeling that I am not accustomed to feeling in a classroom situation or in a situation with another adult.
Yeah.
Is that my shit? Or actually is something else going on here? And I think like as somebody who's also in the field of education or who is in the field of education, that's a very useful, this is like some applied psychoanalysis right there. I have often caught things that could have developed into like really horrible classroom situations by like week 8 or 9 by paying attention to that sort of like, why am I feeling this like awful thing in this one thing? And then being like, what am I going to do about it right now?
Yeah. Wait, so just to try to bring it back to Bion. Yeah. So am I correct that Bion basically says that in a group, these kinds of psychotic energies are just always in play?
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's why we have to, and the basic assumptions exist as defenses so that we don't have to deal with that anxiety that's in play.
There are ways of working through it, right?
Yeah.
So like
channeling it almost.
Because you think about like the options for 1 second, like it's hard because different roles don't map onto one another very easily, right? Like the moral injunction against not yelling against your kid are different from the analyst being like realizing, oh, I can't do my work with a person who now I realize is going to yell at me for 30 minutes. I just can't do this. Can't be my job, right? Versus, I don't know, the teacher who is feeling like a student is trying to a precociously sexual student is trying to do something weird, right? And you've got to like, so they're all different. Like you got to like, leave the door to my office open when we have this meeting, please. Right? That type of thing. Like they're different, like ethical and other things that are happening here for different roles. But for Bion specifically, the idea here is that what's happening in the group, like the sudden shifts in roles, in basic assumptions, in patterns of orientation or dependency or pairing or whatever, these are being communicated on the level of something other than like what's verbally given. And people are immediately stepping into these roles, filling into these roles because the group mentality is opening those roles to them. An example here that's a little bit helpful, and again, I'm going back to the military one because this is actually helpful. And this is one that he gives. You'll note the military stuff is throughout here, not just because he's doing military psychiatry, but as a metaphor.
Yeah,
right?
For sure.
He gives the example.
It's in Freud too.
Yeah, it's in Freud too, but much more here too. And also, Freud would not deal with certain types of people.
Right.
Certain type of acting out, Freud would not tolerate. In fact, he would act out. But with the example here, and what Bion's trying to get at, and why I invoke that example of like, well, here's this guy who's been like, like his tank gets blown up a dozen times, so like he's not like. He'll let you worry about how, like, I don't know, like the hospital cricket club may have some issues in terms of like the local round robin. Like he's going to sit there and be, that's really interesting that you're so worried about that. Like, but it's because he's built the capacity to deal with certain types of anxieties and fears that he can then sort of look at these as an object of study. But an example he sometimes gives of this capacity, right, is of imagine you're a tank commander, or you are a military officer, and you are responsible for a group of men, right, in battle. You are, on the one hand, if you are not a monster and are not going to, or if you are not a psychopath, if you're going to do a good moral job within the constraints of that role, you are going to be inundated by the sounds of their suffering, the images of their dying, you're bearing direct responsibility for sending them into the death. You're going to be the person holding them or listening to them as they cry out for their mother in their last minutes, right? However, your job is to understand that, to keep them from those things, but also to protect what you can of them and of the goals that you're set for you in that working group or your mission or whatever, precisely in the breach of that stuff, right? So, and the analogies aren't quite the same, but you have to develop the capacity, in other words, and he uses a lot of this language, to contain tremendous suffering without fleeing from it or fighting it yourself. So, and this is, I'm thinking of examples here. And I have to be careful about some of these, but I've trimmed this a little bit, but like you can find some, there are cases, for example, where a analyst will have to sit as they listen to tremendous amounts of narratives of sexual abuse, say, right? And the worst thing they could do, well, it's the same thing either way, but it takes two different forms. One of which would be saying, I can't believe that happened to you. That's so terrible. Let's never talk about it again. Right? Or please keep telling me more about this forever, or just leaving the room, right? These are all failures to contain and to use what is being communicated to you as an insight, right? And the flip side of this, and here I think about some really, there's actually a very powerful collected edited volume called Counter-Transference and Counter-Resilience and Counter-Trauma. This is a beautiful volume, but one of the stories in there, I forget the clinician, and this gives a really powerful example of a bit of projective identification, if you will, is an analyst is working with a patient, and for whatever reason, he keeps thinking about how well she's doing now and how well she's doing now, and she's moving better and she's dealing with physical ailments, et cetera. And he has this mental image about this recurrent mental image about how if only she could have danced as a child. And he just says this, right? And then the patient is like, well, that's exactly what my abuser would make me do. I've never told you. But then because he's built this credibility, he'd be like, and clearly the guy doesn't, the analyst in the story doesn't know shit about dance, like doesn't have kids of his own that he makes dance for. But for some reason, as this woman was telling him about her learning how to deal with some traumas, he had the image of a ballerina executing some like triple plie or something. And then she reveals that actually is directly impinges upon a trauma that she had. So that is a communication on that level, right? She's not consciously doing it. She's not manipulatively doing it. And she's in fact working with an analyst who has managed to build the trust that he both flags it. He's not like, well, that's just a random bit of reverie. Right. Fuck that. But that he can then broach it. And when she says, oh, this feels like a betrayal from you, he'd be like, oh, I'm so sorry that happened. Instead of be like, oh, well, I'm not that person. Or actually, no, you should dance. Like there are a bunch of other decisions you can make there. So like it's about building the capacity to contain and to receive communication, the better to modulate what happens in those spaces.
Are you ready to do some applied psychoanalysis, guys?
Lay it on me.
I just love being in a group.
even when you're not physically in a group.
Yeah, maybe most of all when I'm not physically in the group. Yeah.
I thought about that a lot, actually, as a person who's like pretty introverted. And I was like, I felt very like called out by that aspect of Bion, in a way that seemed like a tough but fair sort of like, that there's like some sort of adolescent part of my personality that is like, oh yeah, you're defined by not really being a member of this group. But it's probably not going to change at this point. I don't know. Did any of the rest of you have that sort of like experience?
What, being defined by not being in a group?
Yes, which is also,
that kind of makes me think of that, like, when I was growing up, that like what the subculture of like goth kids or whatever, people that
sure.
They make their identity not wanting to belong to identities,
Yeah.
and their way of not belonging is by actually trying their hardest to belong
Yes.
to a group.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a double bind.
My move is more being really involved in a group and then quitting.
Oh, I could see that.
That's like a big move in my life. Sometimes even starting a group and then leaving. That's a real sweet spot for me.
That's like really high effort.
Yeah.
So, okay, how does Bion make us, who are currently a group, think about groups in our own lives?
I mean, after reading Bion, it's kind of hard not to think about Bion when you encounter groups in your own life. At least that was my experience with it.
Yeah, Dan. Okay, I feel like I sort of bullied Dan into reading Bion, like maybe a little bit a few years ago.
You assigned me homework. I took it.
But you were like so into it. Will you tell your Bion conversion story?
My life story?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, your whole life story.
I was born at a very young age. Yeah.
No, specifically your... Well, I won't ruin the...
No, it's okay. No, yeah. Well, we started... I don't know. We've talked before about we're neighbors. We share a porch often, frequently.
I mean, in the sense that you have a porch that you let us sit on.
Yeah, we share a porch.
Yeah, we share a wall.
I don't know. You both had to listen to me complain about. I was working in a corporate environment for a long time. I was there in the actual like cubicle work for maybe 14 years, and I was doing mailroom gigs and more physical labor for the company before that. But I was in this one company for a very long time, and you started anticipating the ends of like failing group stories before I would even get to them. And I think it was probably a couple conversations of like, what is this superpower? What pill are you taking to be able to anticipate? Yeah, because you don't work in a corporate office. So how would you know what's going on? And you pretty much pulled Bion out of your bag and we're just like, it's this. This is the guidebook. You read this, you will not see groups the same way again. And I don't know, it was like a year after I read Bion for the first time, I quit my job. That was it. It was done. It all became so legible. And I think that with the legibility, like, I don't know, bridged into a kind of nihilism of like, oh, the things that are broken, like the broken group dynamics that were going on in a densely hierarchical, thick layer cake of managerial oversight and stuff like that. It gets to the point where the institution is set up in a way where you can't even articulate solutions that would actually matter because of these group dynamics that are at play all the time.
Yeah.
Because your real motivation is to get along with your coworkers, the people that you rub shoulders with every day. And the labor kind of falls to the side. Like the actual product of the work group falls away because of these other basic assumptions that were coming up.
Yeah.
So it's kind of once that dawned on me that like, oh, actually, maybe it's the very organization that we're all working inside of that's actually spinning out all of the wasted time and all the stress and anxiety that comes with wasted time.
Yeah. And
I had enough. That was the end of it. Yeah. Thanks, Bion. Thanks, Abby.
I'm sure Bion would be proud.
I don't know. That was a quick gloss on the thing. I don't know. Like, haven't you guys ever walked into some kind of a group work setting or maybe you've been parts of groups where the name of the meeting on your calendar is like, figure out strategy for Q2, UI updates or something like that. But the actual work that happens in the meeting is everybody bitching about this one person not doing their job. And do you remember how this was last year under so-and-so? It was so much more efficient. And it just turns out that the entire thing is like a group therapy session and no actual work is done.
Right.
But you still feel, I don't know, like the members of the group still leave that conversation feeling like they did labor. Yeah. Even though the only thing that was exercised was their demons and actually no work whatsoever.
Yeah. I really liked the example that Christine used that is probably relatable to everybody, no matter what side of a classroom you've been on, of like being in a class where the person in charge or being in a meeting where the person in charge is like not doing it well. So like if you're in a meeting and like there's no agenda, personal pet peeve of mine, or if you're like in a classroom and like maybe there's no real lesson plan, or just like the students aren't on board for whatever reason, the basic assumptions starts to come to the forefront. And there's something a little bit like, I'm using this in again, a psychoanalytic sense, but there's something like really profoundly like archaic about these. This is like, it's I don't want to say it's regressed, except in some way to say that, yeah, for Bion, like we're always in groups. And also for us to be in groups is to be in touch with that part of ourselves that is sort of like psychotic, in like the Kleinian sense, not in, I don't mean that in like a casual pejorative sense.
Yeah, let's stay on that for a second. The idea is that the infant is in a disorganized state, and that disorganization has to be contained by the mother. And that's the Kleinian idea. And then Bion basically says that's what it's like to be in a group, that we experience that kind of disorganization. And the way, and in a sophisticated working group, the individual kind of has a more coherent relationship to the whole. But when the group is not working effectively, we kind of fall into that disorganized state, and it's a very anxious, unpleasant state. But then the basic assumptions kind of give us this sense of vitality or purpose that we kind of cling to. Is that right?
Yeah. Okay. Bion himself starts this book and is taking these groups by kind of nonchalantly acting like he's not in charge. He's sort of like, yeah, I'm interested in tensions in groups, as opposed to like, I'm your psychiatrist. I am here to deal with your problems, right? And so like the anxiety and frustration of the people that he's dealing with, and also his own anxiety and frustration, some of which is self-induced and some of which is just a function of him being a person in a group who is supposed to be the leader of that group, is really palpable. To me, Dan was like, how do you know, like, how do you know these things about groups? Like, I felt like when I read this book that I was like, oh, is this why I get a headache every time I'm in like a badly run? Like, and I do, like, I do get migraines after like, not just like overly like emotional meetings, but like just when it doesn't go well, it's like, how can that, like, it's a white collar job. You're just sitting in a conference room or around a boardroom table. I work in academia, so it's not like even like there's a lot of money in play, 'cause none of us have a lot of money. How can that be so upsetting?
We want to be in groups, but also we are anxious about being lost in groups.
Yeah.
To put it in more ecumenical, like kind of Freudian terms, and this applies to how we've been talking about consciousness, or to, you know, like stuff that came up with the uncanny, being in groups involves ongoing work. It doesn't happen naturally.
Right.
And not just work in the sense of like you have to show up at 9 to 5 and it's someone's job to bring the fucking Dunkin' Donuts. It's you have to keep these people in your head. You have to maintain relationships between them. And then in addition to that, you also have to perform certain functions, or at least perform certain nominal functions. I think another way of what I'm thinking about here, and what Bion has helped me think about, what I'd be really curious about what you think about, what you all think about, are like ways in which like heterogeneous groups, or groups that involve like slightly different purposes but work together, particularly across hierarchies, the way basic assumptions and various sort of like formations can play out. Because I mean, this is sort of Bion's part of what Bion argues here, right? And I think we should stipulate this too. Like, it's not, yes, there is a psychotic core to everybody, and yes, there is a psychotic core to groups, but still, you know, there are better and worse groups.
Sure.
Right. Sure. And groups can be more or less functional. And part of the problem here is imagining situations where you could have, in these shifts between group forms or models of leadership in them, you can have leaders step up, or people be sort of conjured into being, where basically they collude with everybody else in perpetuating some sort of situation that is not actually what's going on, right? Think about, I don't know, after COVID, or like after like we're still in COVID, of course, right? But after the initial work from home thing, all these middle managers being like, you've got to get back into the office.
Right.
We're not a functioning group unless we're there. And the answer is, and the question these are wondering is, well, actually, maybe what's going on here is the basic assumption of the group of middle management, right? Which is that they have to exist to surveil what you're doing. And if they're not necessary, then they're going to get fired. But of course, they can't say that. They may not even realize that. Their anxiety is, well, our brand is really suffering just because we don't have that team spirit. And the answer there is, well, no, you're just part of administrative bloat and you probably shouldn't have a job. But you can't say that.
Yeah. I mean, the other work from home thing, it really drives home Bion's point that you're in a group, whether or not you can physically see the other members of that group. I wanted to ask, how much are you guys persuaded by this text? I mean, because we've all talked about it being like applicable in certain ways, but that's not necessarily the same thing.
I don't know if this speaks to like persuasion, but for me, what I found useful was, and it's also the thing that's kind of useful for me about Freud generally, or psychoanalysis generally speaking, is I think I needed somebody like Bion to point a finger in the direction of a thing and assign terms to it for me to actually recognize that I can do this too. Because until then, you're kind of awash in the emotions that you're feeling, the influences that you're getting from the group. And until you kind of learn to step out of your own head and kind of analyze yourself and how you're feeling in this moment and why that could be, all you can do is concentrate on what something feels like.
Yeah.
And you're kind of stuck in that. And Bion kind of gave me the tool to be able to step out of it and be like, oh, maybe this is what this is. Not that I think that it's like a, Bible truth, fundamentalist kind of a concept, but it is useful.
Yeah, I think it's really useful too. I mean, I haven't thought enough about if I think there are more basic assumptions
That's
that
where
might
I'm
be
totally going. Yeah.
operating. Like, are those really the only three? Could we generate more? But I think in terms of just saying, hey, have you ever wondered why you feel so ambivalent about group life? It's because of this. It's not because there's something wrong with you. I think I had always told the story to myself that I had a hard time with groups. And reading Bion, I think now I can say groups are hard.
Yeah. You wrote me an email that at some point that was like, this crystallized like, why is group life so difficult? And it's like, it's
psychotic. And just like, actually just like, I know that sounds kind of glib, but just even having that to say is really helpful. And it's like, it also kind of clarifies for me something about like neurosis versus psychosis in psychoanalysis, and just like, oh, psychosis is about, like fundamental disorganization or some problem with how part relates to whole. And that's just really helpful for me to hold on to.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
But Abby, do you have other basic assumptions that you would want to suggest?
I don't know, but I think you and I are thinking along the same lines here, is that like, I think I'm pretty much persuaded by the idea, and I've probably already said it in these terms, that like the stated or ostensible purpose of a group is almost never, or maybe never, identical with its actual function. And that I find to be like a really useful sort of like key that unlocks so many different social and professional experiences, and is like it palliates something in me also in the way that I think you're saying it does in you. I do think that like Patrick was talking a lot about Bion's military background. I think that's really, really relevant. I also think that is, and but I think that makes him sometimes so obsessed with hierarchy and so obsessed with this idea of like the leader and the led, that like, even though I think I am to one extent or another on board with the fact that like most groups, if they are to carry something out, which is not the purpose of every group, like there are like, we can just hang out and do things like, but that most groups that have a task do need to have some sort of hierarchy. I don't think I'm so invested in that or so sort of like, I think that is dominant, that dominates his thinking to such an extent that maybe that is part of why the output is only these three basic assumptions. And I think we've all already generated some examples. Like, think like Christine, you were talking about like, okay, you're at a, like, you know, like we have all these unpleasant examples, but also like, oh, you're at a party, but like somehow you're not having a good time, even though you're with people that you like. Like, what's the basic assumption there? I don't think that it's necessarily covered. Or like, and I'm like going right back on the hierarchy thing, but like, I do think, and okay, here, think about like a graduate seminar. Okay. The stated purpose, like the work group there is we are all learning about things. Like there's a book and we all have read it, supposedly. And by the end of, 3 hours, we're all going to understand it better. No, that is not what is actually going on. It is a to the death struggle for dominance and,
but sometimes we understand the book better.
Sometimes we understand the book better.
Yeah.
But it is also, and like you and I went to college, we would literally on purpose, Christine, at some point, do you remember we were taking this seminar? This is like flashing back. We can cut this if we decide we don't like it. We took the seminar and we were sophomores and we were the only women. And almost everyone else were like seniors and they were guys. And we took one side of the table on purpose. And we like would have these conversations about how the seminar table was like an arena. And like, to be clear, like we loved that class.
Yeah.
And I learned so much from it. I still have the books. I still have my marginalia. But like, we were clearly doing something other than just trying to understand like Foucault better.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Even though it was a really good class and it had a fantastic professor and we did understand Foucault a lot better by the end.
Yeah.
But like the psychodynamics were like unignorable to the point that we were actively strategizing about it outside of class.
Yeah. I wonder what the professor thought.
Yeah. I don't know.
It occurs to me here just to say, I'm only a little bit familiar with contemporary Bionian thought, and but it is worth saying that much as other people have been like, well, actually, there are, instead of 14 defense mechanisms, there are 37 or whatever. Like there are contemporary Bionians who have proposed a variety of other basic group structures.
Yeah.
I don't recall the names of either the people who came up with them or the specific names that they have them, but I can, the 2 or 3 that I can remember off the top of my head, one is like what you got going in the cult, right? Oneness. Thanks, Dan. Yeah. It's like the oneness thing. Another one might be, I think it's like the me group or whatever, right? It's like the
meanness.
Yeah. And this is like one of those ones that's like speaks to like contemporary changes in like social media or something, where it's like a group, but the group is everyone being like, oh yeah, me too, but not in the me too of solidarity. It's in the me too, like, yeah, I'm just like this too. It's the pro-social narcissist, right? We're a group, but everyone here is uniquely special. We are a group of equal influencers. Right, like we're all thought leaders here, right? Whatever the fuck that means.
God,
right?
that's bleak, but even for you.
Yeah, but we do that. Like that's Davos, right? It's thought leaders and people with sniper rifles and people selling coke. Like that's Davos for you, right? Another one though, like. I mean, we could probably run through a bunch of these and see how they kind of shift, right? Like you probably even say like I think there's probably a basic assumption in like. Well, here, this is the segue to it that I wanted to bring into it, right? Oh, I should say too, just before we sort of move on, there isn't a whole. Bion has a ton of other writing about how thought works, and he's very, again, it's all descriptive. He develops his own vocabulary that's very technical, but in some ways, he's always much more interested in describing and being suggestive than in pinning things down. Even more so than Lacan, who sort of leans into a kind of verbal play. Bion does stuff with graph themes, with mathematical stuff, etc. But it's really about, he's willing to contradict in that he basically wants to cultivate a sort of stance or an orientation towards phenomena in groups, right? So yeah, I think he would be totally cool with being like, yes, you can perceive other basic forms, right?
Yeah.
But in a way that kind of, and I should say, just to say this for the record, there's a lot of Bionian psychoanalysis out there that is not in any way involving groups, right?
Sure.
There's lots of Bionian one-on-one stuff. There's a lot of Bionian psychoanalysts who do group psychotherapy, and Bion himself says that you can't, it's a group setting is not
It's not psychoanalysis.
It's not psychoanalysis,
Yeah.
right? Which is one reason why he isn't as read as he might be in some psychoanalytic context. But a continuity with Freud here, and that seems to bear on something that we're talking about, is one thing Freud really does in his group psychology is that he will identify institutions and then be like, here are the reasons that they give for their being. Here are the reasons that everyone says why this institution exists and why they frequent it. But actually something else is going on. What's the real deal? And why are there so many taboos involved at saying what's obvious about them? Right? So I think about a bunch of examples here, but one that immediately ties into conversation that we had a couple weeks ago, right? You might be like, well, what's the function, the purpose, the basic assumption of the police, right? And that is that they keep people safe, right? Right. Well, if they
that's the stated.
That's the stated.
Yeah,
purpose.
that's the work group.
That's the work group. Yeah, they keep people safe. Clearly, if that were the case, they would presumably kill a lot less people, and we would have less crime than pretty much any other country on the planet, right? So at that point, there's an obvious cleavage between stated function and
basic assumption.
And basic assumption.
Yeah.
Right. And now we can unpack these basic assumptions, right?
Yeah.
And maybe we want to do that about like, well, what are the basic assumptions that this fictional piety that everyone buys into and we punish each other from deviating about the police is? Or another one might be voting, right? Like, what's the purpose
can we stick with it for just a moment? Because I actually feel like you don't even have to tweak experiences in groups even a little bit. Like Christine was saying before, like the basic the basic assumption of the military is fight or flight. The police are a paramilitary organization. I think that is the basic assumption. Like is that what you were thinking of, Patrick? Or
I think let's just be like very, very Marxist about this. Let's just use some Marxist criminology, or hell,
sure. I didn't know we were going to do that today.
Let's just be functional. Let's put our Bionian thinking caps on and just be very functionally descriptive. You would not be wrong. It certainly wouldn't be a mischaracterization descriptively to see the role of the police in the United States as, on the one hand, existing to offer one of the few pathways of upper middle class social mobility to people who otherwise would not have the educational credentials for that, and against the backdrop of a broader constriction of life opportunities. But also their role, functionally speaking, seems to be one, to ensure a monopoly on violence, legitimate or otherwise, as long as they're doing it, and above all else to protect property and maintain inequality. And you may disagree with this, but that would seem, I think that's fairly descriptive, right? I mean,
you're making me want to say something about like how Bion scales, or maybe ask something about how Bion scales.
Yeah.
Maybe, if you have a small observable group of people, then that's where we really see the like pairing fight flight dependency. And then once we get into these like bigger institutional level, then we can talk more in the way that you're describing it. I don't know. I just because he's observing like a dozen people, and yet he's making a claim that the group can be as large as a nation state.
Yeah. And I mean, I do think I said this before, but like a phrase that sticks with me from Bion, and it's when he's talking about why he's talking about like what Freud did and didn't get right. He talks about like you picture me doing air quotes, like the intelligible field of study. And I've gone on about like, okay, the group is always there regardless of whether like, I feel like one of the things that's so interesting about him is he's just like, okay, these phenomena are always operating, like group dynamics are always operating. What you'll see is determined by like the intelligible field of study. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like what you're going to see in a group of 12 people might be radically different than what maybe we are moving then to invoke another distinction that Patrick made before between group and mass phenomena.
Yeah. I mean, this is a bit of a tangent, but it did remind me that one of the things I wish Bion did more is quote from his group sessions. Like whenever he does, it's really illuminating and fascinating, but he doesn't do it that much, actually. I mean, his style is really repetitive, which I found in the end to be a benefit.
Yeah, because it's hard.
By the time he said it 6 times, I was like, oh yeah, it's really clicking for me now. But I mean, one of the reasons why it can be fun or revealing to watch like a documentary about group dynamics or whatever is because you actually like see the thing happening.
Yeah. Christine, I feel like there was a documentary that you were telling me about.
I will take this opening that I opened that door and now I will walk through it.
Walk through it.
So I can't take credit for discovering this film. It was forwarded to me by some friends, but it was this Canadian documentary called Who's in Charge. For a while, I'm having a parapraxis where I kept referring to it as Who Cares? And had to go back and realize that actually, no, it's called Who's in Charge. And it was from the early 80s. The documentarian is this guy, Alan King. I recommend watching this movie if you can find it. It was shown on Canadian television. Basically, this institute gathered 30 unemployed Canadians during the height of an unemployment crisis for the purpose of meeting over a series of, I think, 3 days to talk about the experience of being employed and unemployed. And it's run by these 3 analysts who now I see were clearly Bionian. And when you watch it, I mean, the first time I saw it, I was really angry at the analysts. You know, like they come in, they don't really explain what's happening, what they're doing. They periodically give these cryptic pronouncements about the dynamics of the group. They at the end of, when a session ends, they just get up and leave while people are talking and then are kind of like, well, just like Bion does.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, you knew what time the session would end. And there's just all of this anger directed towards them. And I felt angry at them. And then having read Bion and then rewatching some of the documentary, I could kind of see it differently. But I really recommend this movie if anybody out there is interested in the subject.
Patrick, I know that you are obsessed with a documentary where Metallica goes to psychoanalysis.
God, yeah. That film
which is
rocks.
Just an incredible. Can you give us it's called Some Kind of Monster. Some Kind of Monster.
Yeah.
Can you give us a Bionian reading? Well, first, actually, can you tell us what happens, and then tell us like how this text like what the basic assumptions are on all of that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great movie. It's extremely long. It's from the early 2000s, I think.
Yeah.
It's Metallica, this documentary crew, which was around for the purpose of doing like a making of this album, instead winds up being there for like 2 years. The recording industry, the label, which I forget what it is at this point, but the guy who runs it looks like an Ian McKellen Gandalf kind of guy, like one of those really like wired, burned out guys, hires a performance coach to do group therapy with them.
Yeah.
And this is a guy who previously, I think, had done maybe it was a Spurs or he had previously done his credentials.
Powerful, highly dysfunctional
athletes and
but like people who have achieved like enormous amounts of success and are falling apart. Like that was his niche.
You walk away from this with this vision of competing groups or like what can or can't be said in these groups, what can or can't be said even about these groups, right? And how much that also relates to material conditions and anxieties about, like, literally the studio is paying millions of dollars to I think they rent out like an entire old like military barracks for a recording studio. Then they go play a concert in San Quentin for prisoners, and it feels like I've had some anger too. And if it hadn't been for rock, I'd have been here. It's the most gross shit you've ever seen. It's a real late empire shit show. Lars Ulrich liquidates his ludicrous stash of Basquiat paintings and Sotheby's. It's a shit show, right? But what it kind of does, and I think this is a thing we should bring in here because Bion does talk about, is money is big into this.
Yeah.
And Bion is one of the only people I've read in a primary psychoanalytic work to really talk about the role of money in shaping how groups work, or anxieties about money in shaping how groups work.
Well, what I was thinking about while you were talking is how it totally makes sense for Metallica to undergo group therapy, right? Like, and for them to approach it as a project of group dynamics. You know, whatever winds up happening in the documentary and however the group shifts or changes or reforms into different groups is totally fascinating. But like, of course, a group dynamics specialist would be required. I think what seems so sort of troubling to me about how Bion arrives at his conclusions is that the people that he's working with at Tavistock like aren't there to experience. Like, my understanding is that they're not like, we're already a group and our group is not functioning well and we need someone to help us get our group back on track. They're just individuals who want therapy, and Tavistock is putting them in a group. And so Bion, who comes in and is basically like, we don't really do, this isn't really a space for individual therapy. I'm just going to study what you guys do. He winds up getting these amazing insights, but it does feel a little icky to me the way he gets there. Just because it seems like the people aren't totally clear on what they're participating in. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't want to overstate that point, but it is like a sensation I have in the book.
I do share, Christine, that sort of sense. And I don't know if it's like, I feel like it is an actual ethical or objection, or if it was just like something that as a reader felt really heightened. I don't know, because he gets to something that's so real about groups. And you almost get the sense that he's like, well, if I had come in and done the thing that's like, I'm Dr. Bion, we're all here today for the purpose of blah, 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 blah. Mr. X, because that's how he always writes his like Ms. Y and Mr. X, like, would you like to say something about, why you're here? That like, that might work worse.
Yeah.
Because in some way would be disingenuous given his own conception of groups. But also I think there's this thing that's like, you can't, he also couldn't come in and say, hi, I'm Dr. Bion. There are these things called basic assumptions.
Yeah. I mean, I think
right?
he discovered them by not doing what, he was expected to do. I think that I said this to you before we met for this, I feel super activated by the idea of being in one of these groups. Like, I have read a fair bit of psychoanalysis, and I'm always my typical reaction to reading it is just being super on board. I'm like, infantile sexuality? Yes. Oedipus complex? You bet. I'm just like, all the stuff that, my students are really up in arms about. Sure. I'm just like, oh, you guys don't know. Just it's the truth, But when I get to this, and I imagine myself being one of these groups, I start to feel really panicky.
Right.
And I start to like feel that, psychotic disruption or whatever. Like the experience of being in a group that doesn't have a clear goal that we're meeting, I find really distressing.
Yeah.
And I have worked in some like non-hierarchical group situations, and I really don't like them. I really don't like feeling those basic assumptions flourishing.
Yeah.
I experience it. I just really hate it. And so reading Bion was a little bit activating on those grounds.
I remember when we were early in the days of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, and we would go to various like sort of pedagogy, to various conferences where other folks were doing like we don't actually do like particularly non-traditional pedagogy, but doing like outside of the university kind of organizations, and a lot of them were very much like totally horizontal. And I've done a lot of work with like trying to make classrooms more horizontal in some ways. But I do think that there is, we always landed at the Brooklyn Institute on the like, no, actually like someone has to be driving the train. Right. And I don't think that it's entirely just to like fend off anxiety. I think that part of it is about like, how do you get a task done?
It feels like the categories of basic assumptions that he lands on in the book are just they're convenient naming conventions for what's actually like underneath them is this. There's like a movement of positionality where like if the position shifts from one person to another, or even worse, like or more violent, is when a position turns into a vacuum and people in the group feel the need to fill it with stuff.
Yeah.
There's this, it's another kind of like hydraulic shifting of energies that then can like, they fall into genres of phenomenon that are like these basic assumptions.
Yeah.
His way of getting this out of the group was just to cause violence to this by like, you know what, you expect this role to be filled. I'm going to turn it into a vacuum. Let's watch you all squirm and figure out what this energy is. Something like that.
But you say more about money, because what does he say about money?
So, on the money point, and I should say this is in the latter bit of the book, and it's a little harder to read because this is where he finally does start using abbreviations for different types of systems, right? But the bottom line up front, to use actually a fairly helpful military expression, is that he suggests that his way of thinking about groups, which distinguishes between the overt purpose and the function that is hidden, can be brought to bear on the science, what is called the social science of economics, but also to think about changes in monetary value or ascriptions of value in social circumstances where basic assumptions or group forms change. So one of the examples he gives right away is the idea of like the Wehrgild, the blood debt, right? You kill somebody in Germanic law, you have to either you get killed or you pay some sort of fine, or the idea of like a bride price as a dowry. Right. So like this is, again, the group is changing. Someone is leaving this group. They're becoming a new group. Money somehow facilitates that change.
Interesting.
So what he seems to be saying here, and this is where he goes with it on the national level, is that he seems to, the question he's asking is, how can we think about these changes of fluctuations in figures, or literally the value of currency, as not responding narrowly to econometric calculi of necessity and efficiency, but instead as buying or speaking to or palliating those underlying anxieties or fears about groups in transition. So here's an example. So consider the attitude towards money and the value that is set on it in a religious group, right? Where and I forget this abbreviation, but a religious group where he wants to consider a situation in which there is a dependency-oriented religious group where you're giving money because there's a megachurch pastor, right? Or there's the Pope, right? Versus what's the role of giving money in a nation? And here's an example he gives of it: when a nation as a group goes into full fight or flight mode. In the latter, the value of money is linked with its convertibility into munitions of war. In the former, with its value in offsetting feelings of guilt for dependence beyond reasonable time limits, and on parents more than human by the purchase of feelings of virtue. Right? My speculations appear to suggest that the concepts of basic assumptions and proto-mental systems hold promise of facilitating inquiries in areas other than those from which they were derived, but so forth. The glaring difficulty is to state the basic assumption is operative in a large group. For example, are we to say that the basic assumption in a nation at war is the same as the basic assumption of flight or fight? And if so, is it true that this would hold for all parts of the nation? For example, the agricultural community, etc. Right. So I think he wants to understand flows of money as being like indexes or trailing signals or enactments even, or like, I guess, communications, we could call them, of nice anxieties about group structure.
Yeah. And while, to think back to this question about the family versus the group, I mean, I guess, would you guys say that the group activates these intense anxieties just because the roles aren't as obviously predetermined? Like in the family, Like who's mommy, who's daddy, who's child, or, that's all kind of like, that's at least a role that to play. Whereas in the group, the question of individuality and boundaries is just like a much more open question.
I wonder if one way to put it might be that what the group, what adult groups do for us, the anxiety that they activate, and which are quickened by having to deal with complicated things like money, is that they can kind of defamiliarize the familial and what seemed to be natural and given. And they reveal how, actually, being in this family always took work, right? Being in this family, there were always roles and responsibilities, right? And the basic assumptions about what was or wasn't talked about, and money is one of those things that either oftentimes doesn't get talked about in families or gets talked about a lot, or, is that those are things we are kind of normalized into, but that take effort, demand psychic expenditure, and set us up for certain things. And then when we move into a new group and we have to start paying dues or something, I'm thinking about like all this stuff like I don't want to pay taxes to Joe Biden. I don't want Joe Biden for my father. Right? Well, it's like, so there's some issues here with Joe Biden, with your father, and with money, right? They're all related.
Right. Well, and he has that line, Bion has that line about how being in a group takes work, and it's like a fantasy. Did you read this before, Abby? I can't remember. It's like a fantasy to imagine that we wouldn't need to learn how to do that work.
Yeah. I think that's right. Can we move from paying your dues to another, from money to a different kind of thing that circulates, which Christine, I know, really wanted to talk about, which is group chats.
The group text chat.
The group chat.
The most important thing in my life.
Which Bion could not possibly have foreseen.
No. I don't want to, I feel like I can't say too much here, but I am involved in 2 different group text chats, and they are really important to me. And go through periods of being dormant and then active again, and dormant and then active again. And they're fascinating. And sometimes the basic assumption is really clear and things are really clicking. And sometimes it's a bit more mysterious what we're all doing together.
I was reading, I haven't really thought about this, but I remember reading an article in the Times like a few weeks ago about like men's group chats. Did you read this?
My husband is also in a couple of different group chats.
Yeah. But it was like men, you can talk to each other as long as it's not face to face. Have you considered doing it on your phone or watch? And it was all about like, you wouldn't believe the sorts of feelings that men can express as long as it's like via group chat.
As long as it's mediated, distanced, and their bodies aren't in the same room.
Exactly. But it was like kind of sweet also. It was like, it had that sort of like poignant, sad, yet sweet sort of like.
I mean, the group chat is so intimate.
Very intimate.
It's so intimate. I mean, everything that happens through our phones, just fascinating, But yeah, like the things that can be shared in the group chat setting that maybe would never be shared in real life. The thing about the group chat is you can kind of enter or exit at any time. So as opposed to being in a classroom or a group therapy session or a meeting at work or whatever, like you actually kind of can choose when to engage and when not to engage. And I wonder if that is a way of further containing that psychotic energy.
Also, family group chats. Some families have them.
Oh yeah, I don't.
Some
I don't
families
do
don't. My family doesn't do that.
I mean, one of my group chats really exists in order. It really is like a fight or flight common enemy group chat.
Yeah.
And that really is kind of its stated purpose. So reading Bion was really clarifying for that.
So like the stated purpose and the basic assumption actually coincide.
Yeah.
Like the unconscious is conscious.
Yeah. And there are, of course, times, because it's a group chat, so it's not always on task, where we kind of get away from the fighting of a common enemy, but then we find our way back.
The great unifier. It like reminds you why you all love each other. Remember this demon?
Patrick, I feel like you must have something to say in terms of Bion and political analysis. Like we've been like shockingly like
or
quiet
Twitter.
on
Patrick,
that.
would you talk about Twitter?
Goodness, we haven't even really talked about like virtual spaces. What's the basic assumption in the dying days of Twitter? And also the basic assumption of like blue sky is seems very different,
I mean,
right?
The basic assumption of Twitter was that everyone was yearning for death, right? And now it's actually happening more and more than ever. And
people are saying
nobody's talking about this.
No, actually, I think that's really an interesting question of like, how does a group end?
Yeah.
You know, like how does a group come to be and then how does it end?
Yeah.
That's the one.
Group chat, terminable and interminable.
But like the energy of the group chat is just or the group, right? The energy of the group is just different than the energy of the one-on-one interaction.
Yeah.
And we get such different things from those two kinds of interactions.
I do not care for the group chat personally. I have to say, it feels like, although, I mean, I guess technically I have one with you, Dan, and Patrick, and Mahalia, but that's like, Mahalia is like, I made something delicious and I put it on your stoop. Like, that's the best. Like, and then I'm like, I did too. And then like we run downstairs and exchange snacks. Like, that's a very task. And I feel like we exchange like it's pretty task focused. And like one of the tasks was also, because it was our quarantine pod group chat, was to be like, hey, there's other people and we care about you. And sometimes, can I see your dog? Because I'm having a hard day. But beyond, like, that's the only group chat that I will regularly respond to because I know what its demands are, which are like, can you come get this delicious thing off my stoop? Or will you, maybe a little pet sitting? It's like all good vibes. Beyond that, I feel like, why are all these people talking to each other on my phone?
Do you guys have like situational friends or like group friends, people that you really enjoy spending time with them in group settings where they bring a certain like something to the group dynamic that you really love, but you don't usually hang out with them alone?
Yes. And I think that is the part of life that was really threatened by the pandemic. Like, because there were certainly people that I wasn't going to see during like the height of the pandemic, but I missed that texture, which is important to me.
I feel like we've been like noticeably light on talking about politics, given, the sort of relation between thinking about groups and thinking about political organizations, et cetera. Patrick, I feel like this is in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, and I suppose it's my job to be depressing too in this one. It's my role in this group. But like, look, I think like we could take a lot of like just working with. So look, just to reprise, we've already have this kind of cool toolkit, right? We've already, to reprise from the previous episode, someone makes a political appeal or makes some sort of political statement. You can do this, the two-pronged move of being like, who are they asking you to identify with, or what are they asking you to identify with, and what's excluded from that? Mm-hmm. And also, what does this license you to do? What does this normalize, or what does this justify? What feelings does this make legible and allow you to step into, right? I think we could probably, in a similar mode, use Bion to ask some questions about like when people insist on their centrality as a role, or insist on the centrality of a certain group or role for society, for you got to have this, you got to have these people, or what else are you supposed to do, or right, that you can find some difficult answers, or you could see the possibility of some difficult answers by calling attention, a la Bion, to the distinction between ostensible purpose and basic assumption, right? I'll think of some. Let's we run off a bunch of examples here, right? Like the ostensible purpose of our ruling elites who are elected to office, right, is that they are supposed to better regulate the body politic and diminish social friction and uplift standards of living for everybody. Sure, why not? Right? That's the ostensible purpose.
Stated purpose.
Right? Actual function, you could probably arguably say that a lot of them are just waiting to check out, right? They're going to take that check long enough. I mean, how many politicians, like the job, what's Pete Buttigieg's job really? I think what we could do, we could be like, wow, it sure is weird that a certain political party that is nominally in the majority still seems to govern as though it's in the minority. And it may almost seem to be the case that they would prefer to be in the minority. What if we might say that the purpose of the DNC is less to get Democrats elected so that they can govern than to have just enough Democrats elected such that they can maintain the fig leaf of legitimacy while also keeping people having jobs in the DNC on the consulting circuit?
But Patrick, I have a question, which is, my question is, do we need Bion to say that? Because it sort of seems like, the question of like, what is really going on here? There's an official story and then there's a bunch of other stuff. That's a kind of like standard psychoanalytic viewpoint.
Yeah.
I think you could get to that reading of the Democrats without Bion.
Yeah.
I think that's true. I think it clarifies certain things when it comes to activities that are ones that are supposedly about expand or even constituting these groups. Right?
Yeah, it seems to me to be the most applicable in terms of like if you were actually in a session of Congress.
Yeah.
If you were actually in a committee meeting. Like there's something about the way that the working group is trying to achieve a task in an allotted amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
And the basic assumptions are pulling at that, right? Pulling at that and making it harder to achieve that ostensible goal.
Yeah, I find this the most compelling when I'm thinking about the workplace, or like social situations. But I'm finding it harder to map it on to sort of, or not harder, but just I think this is maybe what you're getting at. A little less rewarding, a little like.
Just like what is a group, right? A group exists. I mean, like what Bion's groups are bounded by time, space, and number, and so like the Democratic Party is something that stretches over years or whatever. So I don't know. It's just like the object that he's dealing with, I think would be, like I said, like the Democratic Party in a strategy meeting.
Yeah.
So then, I mean, I think one thing we can talk about, and this I think takes both these points into consideration. This points to the resistance, actually, in some ways, why it's harder to think about politics than it is to think about the workplace, is that we don't like thinking about politics as just a workplace, right? I mean, how many years now have we been having the sky is falling, the debt ceiling is going to destroy everything, this is the end times, and now Congress needs to take its vacation. Right? I mean, or even some of this stuff where you have to ask like the role of Supreme Court justices and like what their actual priorities seem to be and what function they serve versus what function we are asked to attribute to them. And this, I think, is where the Bion stuff comes in, right? Because it's where we as a broader group are asked to ratify the function, virtue, whatever, in any way, to disavow the actual basic arrangement of a whole bunch of groups on a regular basis, right? I'm thinking here, another one might be like, well, we every year or every 4 years are supposed to vote. Right? We are the voters, right? A question might be like, well, what actually is the work done by that?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, for me, I'm just thinking out loud here. I'm returning to Christine's earlier question, which is just like, and this is sort of where we started. It's like, why is group life so difficult? And that there is like an enormous relief in reading Bion and being like, oh, because it just is.
But I think, the question is, why is group life so difficult? And then a second question is, why is it so hard for groups to get things done?
Yeah.
And the answer to that Bion has is because there are forces whenever people are in a group that are actively conspiring against getting anything done.
Right.
That actually people don't want to achieve the task of the group. That we are like, by instinct or by human nature or by the nature of group life or animal life or whatever, we are compelled to work against the stated function of the group.
Yeah. So it's a miracle that we ever get anything done in some way.
Yeah.
Christine, thank you so much for being here. Can you tell us where we can read some of your recent writing?
Yeah, thank you to Dan and Patrick and Abby. This was really fun. You can read some recent pieces that I've written in the New York Review of Books. One is on Bret Easton Ellis. One is on the Ibsen play, A Doll's House. They are both available online.
We will put those in the show notes.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you next week.
I declare this group successfully realized. Bye-bye.
This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield, Christine Smallwood, and Dan Yowell. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.